said what I was looking for, didn't even have a chance to stop and use the restroom, turned around, walked right back upstairs, and walked in the courtroom 2 seconds before you. So no, I needed some time to actually look for it.
Okay. Let's bring the jury in, please.
Just for clarification,
bring them in.
are you asking for a case that says that it is not substantive evidence, or a case that says we're entitled to a cautionary instruction when an evidence is being introduced for one purpose but not the other?
No, I'm looking for a case that says in an MGR case, when the expert relies on hearsay, which he can, data from other people, that I have to give the jury a cautionary instruction. So, because I believe it would be very confusing, they wouldn't understand what I was talking about. So I want you to give me some legal authority that says I must do that. And if I see it, I'll do it.
So that says that the evidence is only to be used for his opinion, not as substantive evidence.
In an NGRI case, yes. And I agree with it as to the premise of it, but I think it's very confusing to the jury to get. I don't think it's necessary.
Okay, but so the court agrees that if evidence is being introduced for one reason but not the other, we would be entitled to a cautionary instruction. It's just...
I want to see as it would apply to a sanity offense. Defense. Okay, let's bring them in, please.
In the jury box and seat, John.
Doctor, you were talking about Officer Rizzo and the reality testing. And he was the officer who
Yes.
Baker acted him
I believe I finished that.
Okay. You finished everything you need to say about that?
Yes. Yeah.
Any other reality testing issues that you wanted to bring up?
Well, there were some emails.
And what emails are we talking about?
Well, on the email on New Year's Eve, that was...
To the attorney?
Yes, the first contact since August of 2018. And, it was just a very basic business-related email that he wanted to get back in touch with her. I mean, you can read it if you'd like.
Go ahead.
It's going to take a minute for me to find it. find what he said, but she had an email saying that she was
Just
ready to
first.
cut.
Yes.
Professional. With the,
Sure, yes.
this. Is this your question, memory?
Oh, sure. It's dated December 31st at 4:45. Hey Genevieve, please give me a call as soon as you can, add the phone number. I will be ready to retain you as soon as possible or can meet at the office when you come back from the holidays with cash. And she responded to him, and later at 11:08 p.m., he responded back, perfecto, will do first thing. She said she could set up an appointment with him for January 6th. Call her office, and he said, perfecto, we'll do first thing. So sorry I waited, thinking things would be different. Happy New Year. So, you know, short emails, but taking care of business, certainly.
And did he continue to email her?
Well, she got back to him. I can see you first thing when I get back on Tuesday, January 6th, 10 a.m. Would that work? Please let me know. And he got back to her in the morning of January 1st. Yes, I appreciate it. Thank you very much on such short notice.
Did he contact her on January, after she contacted him on January 2nd?
On the 2nd, he said, let's see if I can find that one, the 4th, the next one I have is the 4th. I think I read what he said on January 2nd.
What did he say on the 4th?
On the 4th, no, on the 2nd, excuse me. Sometimes these are, the order confuses me. On the 2nd, thanks, we really need to do the non-removal because after doing the visitation up there, I had concerns and called CPI, and Michelle said that she passed her drug test and was going to file false report and tried to get the retaining order, one for me and one for Phoebe, and it got denied and was recommended I do that by the investigator. They had knives and live ammo, and she looked under the influence, and the guy she is with verbally scolded her harshly in front of me and has been arrested for DV on her twice at the 2118 Delightful Drive, Ruston, zip code. His name is funny, but it's Guy Kisser. Is there anyone at your office to sign a retainer? I told Michelle I was going to when you got back, and she stopped harassing us. But this is serious missing.
The series of emails between him and his attorney leading up to this, how did you take that into consideration, apply it to your analysis?
Well, that email, obviously there's no punctuation, so you can say that he's running his thoughts together. Could be for other reasons that there's no punctuation. But even so, the content of what's in that email is not, in my opinion, any way irrational. Is it appropriate for him to call her Missy? I don't know the quality of their relationship. She had described Mr. Jonchuck as having an effeminate presentation. Perhaps they kind of joked in those ways. I don't know, but the content of that shows that he's tuned into a very stressful situation, which is the potential custody issue. He's got a grasp of some things that he wants her to do and focus on that are reality-based topics to prove his point and his case. And there's an attention to detail that seems very appropriate. The punctuation issue, you know, how people punctuate and don't punctuate and all that email, texting kind of idiosyncratic ways people do that. I can't really comment on that. But his thoughts, even if I'm going to say his thoughts are going rapidly and there's some pressure, kind of manic-like stuff going on, I mean, the content is still very reality-based. And then also, he said, also if you can add this HCSO arrest inquiry, Guy Kisser and Pasco County arrest, Guy Kisser arrested for violent violent crimes, attempted murder and disorderly conduct, disgusting. So that's there as well.
The issues that were building up to the bridge,
Yes,
would they have included financial,
definitely,
residential,
definitely,
interpersonal primary relationships,
yes,
potential loss of Phoebe as custody?
yes.
When he got to the bridge, you said he realized that the officer was stopping him?
Yes, those factors that you just brought up were very important to me.
Okay, and can you explain why?
Well, again, the motivations for what was going on at the time, I believe that there was this primary conflict that was very real and very concerning to Mr. Jonchuck. But it wasn't the only thing that was conflictual in his life right around the time of Phoebe's death.
What other things were there?
Well, if I go back, I talked about the psychotic stuff and then the borderline side of things.
Correct.
If after looking at that, there is some adequate reality testing, there's some real reality-based stressors in his life that he was responding to.
Such as?
Well, if we go back to when he took Phoebe from his mother and had that big verbal conflict with his mother, again, it was reported that he felt jealous of Phoebe. He left his mother, so that living situation was behind him. He went to his dad's, and he's at his dad's about 2 days, and Mr. Jonchuck described to me that the evening of the 7th, his dad came home and they got into a verbal argument. And Mr. Jonchuck said that that's okay, I'll leave, we'll be gone in the morning. Now, he explained a similar type of argument to another doctor, Dr. Mackless, and he said that at that time he and his dad got into a fight. He unplugged the phone because he didn't want his dad to call law enforcement because he was on probation. So there's indication that he was aware of probation sanctions. And that's an important consideration because that has to do with being aware of legal boundaries and that you could get in trouble with legal entities, probation, the law. So he said that. He's told me, I asked him about that, he denied that he said that, but he did tell me that there was a fight with his dad and he had to leave. Then he goes to Noemi's house. As I said earlier, Noemi kept asking him, told him to leave, and in the context of that, all she could say, she never saw him visually, but that his text stopped after she said she was going to call the police. So you see, just a few hours before the murder, he's responding to, it seems that he responded to, if I call it, you better leave or I'll call the police, and certainly the issue about probation. But getting back to the stressors, he doesn't feel that he has a place to live, and he goes to Noemi's, and so he feels rejection from his mother. He feels that his father's situation, they've had a chronically unstable relationship throughout their life, and he doesn't feel he can stay there. And his father said there was not an argument. So there's a difference of opinion, but in Mr. Jonchuck's mind, there were conflicts with his father. Even if that was part of a psychotic process, he felt that he could not stay there, and that relationship was not adequate or good. And then he goes to someone else, and the same thing happens. So he has acute means right at the time, acute relationship instability. His basic social support network is not there. And with that, he has residential instability. That's a big factor, particularly if you're interested in custody of the child. The financial issue that you brought up, obviously he had been using Phoebe's Social Security funds to at least partially support himself. He had in his pocket the letter from Social Security Disability, which I've already talked about, but it was basically he had to be accountable for the money that he didn't have, that he had used otherwise. he had just started a job. His mom had gotten him a job, and he didn't show up. He was just there a couple of days, but he didn't show up. Now, if he's going to lose money from Social Security disability, and he has to make money to work, and employment's always been a stressor, that's an additional stressor. So basically, some very important support systems in his life were crumbling. And of course, the biggest issue was the ongoing issue of the custody. So there's a lot of, you know, the financial issue, the relationship issue, the housing issues, those weren't delusions. They weren't part of a dream. They were very real. They were very real and very impactful, as they would be for anyone. Those are basic issues, you know, money, shelter, relationships, and not only were they crumbling, but these are particularly the relationships associated with long-standing problems that Mr. Jonchuck's had with his mother, with his father. The relationship with Michelle Kerr, certainly not as long-standing, but everything is crumbling, and there's an incredible amount of anger, dissatisfaction. This is a person who, when things are not going his way, has historically acted out. So in conjunction with the custody issue, I think all of these things that you brought up were incredibly important to me in trying to get a sense of what was going on and how he would respond to it. And I talked about his traditional way of responding to these types of situations.
Some of the other doctors talked about the possibility of suicide by cop. Were you present for when they talked about that?
Objection, relevance.
Yes, I was here.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I was here.
What did you take from their discussion?
Well, if I recall correctly, and I do, in this situation at least, two of the doctors said that...
Objection, hearsay.
Overruled.
Two of the doctors said that suicide by cop was a possibility.
If it's a possibility, what does that mean with regards to the issue in hand as to not guilty by reason of insanity?
Well, my understanding of suicide by cop is that someone knows if they do something threatening towards a law enforcement officer, if they engage in certain behavior, the officer is going to see that behavior as threatening or wrong and is going to retaliate. So it shows that the person is aware that if they do something wrong, there will be a response. So they're aware of their behavior because they do it, and they're aware of the wrongfulness of that.
And if they're aware of their behavior and they're aware of the wrongfulness, can they be found not guilty by reason in this sense?
Well, my opinion is no. Over the years, there's many situations and many evaluations I've been involved in where suicide by cop was a relevant issue, and in my opinion, never met the insanity standard. It's kind of the opposite, actually. So that's my opinion.
The defendant did not proselytize, I think is the word, where he would tell the officers why he did what he did on the bridge. I had to save the world, avoid the ice age. He did not indicate it to any officers subsequent to the crime that you're aware of.
Well, again, my assessment of when he was on the bridge certainly involves that, but began before that.
Okay. What do you mean by that?
Well, I talked about how I perceive the driving to the ice age, so I won't go over that. But I asked Mr. Jonchuck, when he was up on the bridge and he saw the lights, what did he think? Now, we've already talked about the other part of the ice age and leaving and stuff. But I asked him, what did he think when he saw police lights? And he told me that he thought he was being pulled over for speeding. So he's telling me, I thought I'm going to be generous, a minute before Phoebe's murder, he's telling me that he was aware that Officer Vickers was a law enforcement officer. And he's telling me that law enforcement officers will punish someone or stop someone if they're doing something wrong. So, again, a few hours earlier, he stopped texting Noemi because of the threat of the police. A little bit, an hour or two before that, the whole his reports to Dr. Macklis about the probation. So I'm seeing a pattern here of a guy right up to the burner who has some appreciation of legal boundaries and the legality or the illegal aspect of his behavior. Doesn't mean that he wasn't having the psychotic symptoms. It does not mean that. But you can have both. And again, how far he was unraveled, I can't say specifically, but I think he was raveled enough to understand legality and illegal. And that's what the insanity defense is. Again, I talked to him about the delusions. And again, as I said earlier, delusions are exceptionally powerful. He didn't follow the reported delusion, but this is...
Objection, not responsive to the question.
I forgot the question.
Exactly.
Did he follow the pattern of the delusion?
Go ahead.
Well, he didn't, and then getting back to what you were asking about proselytizing.
Yes.
Yes. There's no one way he would respond to Officer Vickers or anything, or anyone, but he believed that he told myself and two other doctors that he believed that he had to engage in that behavior to save the world. Told one doctor he was God, told me the devil was talking to him. Now, we've all seen people...
I think we're getting past the responses. Ask the next question, please.
On the bridge, the defendant made a statement to the officer. Did he tell you that?
Yes, he did.
What was that statement?
Well, he told me that he said, "You have no free will, I do."
Did he explain why he said that?
He said he didn't know.
How did that impact upon your analysis in this case?
Well, again, 1 second before that, he was in motion. He stopped the car and got out and went to the back and got Phoebe. But he knew that he was talking, that was a police officer behind him. So he's telling a police officer, he knew as a police officer, that you have no free will. Now, that can be interpreted multiple ways, but at the very least, he knew what he was doing, and I believe that he was telling the police officer, I'm going to do what I'm going to do. You have no free will to stop me. So I think my interpretation of that, it was way too close to him telling me that he was well aware that Officer Vickers wasn't a demon. He didn't have a mask with horns. There was no psychotic aspect to him knowing that was a law enforcement officer. Told him, I'm not putting any words in Mr. Jonchuck's mouth. This is the way I see it. Mr. Policeman, you have no free will. He had a plan of action at that moment, and I believe that he played it out. And again, he didn't say anything about it, got into his car, and absconded.
You brought up absconded in his car. You had talked about him turning north and how that did not go with the delusion that he was under. Did you take into consideration that he blew through the toll booth, that he went 80 to 90 miles an hour, that he drove the wrong way on the street and had to be stopped by stop sticks? Did that, when he fled the scene, did you take that into consideration, and how?
Well, all of those things. The one thing that wasn't mentioned was the U-turn. My understanding was that a police officer got behind him. He was going to pull over. He's going north on 75. Puts on his turn signal. Goes to the right to pull over. Goes around. Put on his turn signal the other way. Goes around. The police officer takes off driving the wrong way. That clearly suggests to me that he's trying to avoid apprehension. Also, from what I've read, he drove in a defensive way to avoid oncoming cars. So that suggests to me that he had known what he had done and trying to flee, that it was wrong. There was no explanation, that he was being chased by a chariot of demons or something of that nature. So these are things that I have to infer, but I don't have any other explanation for them that fits more in the psychotic realm.
And What were you originally hired for in this case, Doctor?
Well, I was hired to determine whether or not, in my opinion, Mr. Jonchuck met the definition for insanity, legal definition for insanity.
The defendant, when he was stopped by officers, said things like Babylon, Michael. Would you expect him to have indicated the delusion?
Objection.
Your Honor, may we approach?
That's the question.
Would he have expected him to proselytize the delusion that he was under at the time?
Oh,
Well, let me say that that was, in my opinion, powerful information that I thought long and hard about. What he said to Officer Hubble, I believe. it was.
Objection, Your Honor, may we
May we
approach?
approach?
yes.
agree, Dr. Burston, that John has a very serious major mental illness, correct?
Yes,
And you have heard through the course of this trial, you sat in while Dr. Macklis testified,
yes,
and Dr. Otto,
yes,
and Dr. Mayer,
yes,
and you heard all three of them testify that Mr. Jonchuck suffers from a very serious mental illness.
yes. I even gave the same diagnosis as Dr. Macklis in that regard.
And with regard to Dr. Otto and Dr. Mayer, the diagnosis varied somewhat, but it's a mood disorder that you believe he suffers from, correct?
Well, he has mood problems and he has exhibited psychotic symptoms. You know, as Dr. Mayer said, if we all got into a room and talked about it, we'd be much more the same than different. No disagreement there.
Okay. You're aware that Mr. Jonchuck was treated by Dr. Williams at Gainesville, up at the hospital, the state hospital?
Yes,
And Dr. Williams has been treating Mr. Jonchuck for a serious mental illness for quite some time,
yes,
about 4 years, give or take.
yes,
Okay. And Mr. Jonchuck has been here at the county jail as well,
yes,
and has been treated by Dr. Hernandez, the psychiatrist at the jail.
yes,
And you know that John is on a variety of medications for his serious mental illness.
yes,
He takes the Haldol injection,
yes.
Haldol pills,
I'm aware of all this, but go ahead.
the Seroquel,
Yes,
Klonopin,
yes,
and Wellbutrin.
yes,
And you had the opportunity to review the records from the state hospital in Gainesville?
I didn't review them page by page, but I reviewed enough to know that he has, that what they've diagnosed him with, how they're treating him, and that there's been a slow but steady progression to him returning to court for this trial.
And so it's been over the course of some 4 years that Dr. Williams has been working with him on the right combinations of medications.
I assume that's true.
You do not dispute that John meets the first prong of the criteria for the insanity defense?
No, I don't dispute that, no.
In the past, and maybe, I think even in your testimony yesterday, if I'm remembering correctly, you referred to this case as a complicated case.
Yes,
And when we've talked about where your opinion comes down as to the second prong of the insanity defense,
yes,
you kind of used a hand gesture to talk about how that weighing process is, right?
well, and I tried to explain it in greater detail today, but yeah, most definitely, my reference to it being a complicated case is because there are definitely two sides to the coin, as I've said previously.
The bipolar one with mood incongruent psychotic features, is that your working diagnosis for John, or one of them anyway?
Well, again, as I said, I thought of this much more in terms of Mr. Jonchuck's diagnostic picture around the offense time period. As I said, I believe yesterday, that at the time of the offense, and this isn't invalidating the state hospital or Dr. Otto or Dr. Mayer, but at the time of the offense, he would not have qualified for schizophrenia, schizoaffective disorder, just on the duration of the illness. What's important to keep in mind, and I don't have an answer for this, Mr. Jonchuck, as Dr. Macklis described, and Dr. Otto alluded to it as well, there's no evidence anywhere that he's been as impaired, that he was as impaired prior to the offense and prior to the offense time period. He'd never been as impaired as he's presented by the end of January and forward. the state hospital who exhibited significant psychotic symptoms that would be consistent with schizoaffective disorder, bipolar type, in my opinion. But I'm much more, and this is why I didn't review all the records from the state hospital. I reviewed them enough to know what they say, and I don't argue with them. I argue with 4 years of records, right?
So,
But I have to look at really at the time of the offense, on the bridge.
right. And so whether, you said you might disagree with the schizophrenia or schizoaffective because the symptoms hadn't been recognized for at least 6 months prior to December, is what you're saying.
Prior to January's 8th, yes.
But you agree after the arrest, those symptoms that had started got worse.
Well, they appeared, obviously on the surface, they got worse, and I'm not sure why. I can't tell you why they did, and no puns intended. Did this whole thing cause a complete unraveling, or did it push Mr. Jonchuck over the edge? Has there been some embellishment? I don't know, and I'm less concerned about the state hospital because I have no arguments with what they've done, and then obviously they've restored Mr. Jonchuck considerably. They've done a good job. There's some difference between before and after, and I'm not, in my professional capacity, I can't say with certainty what accounts for that. And then I'm most interested in those moments on the bridge, January 8th.
Yesterday you talked a lot about your forensic work and the court-appointed lists and the different things that you do. You have a clinical practice also where you're actually seeing patients?
No, all of my work is forensic assessment. For years, when I was at the university, not only did I treat people with schizophrenia, I treated their families. I started groups, therapy groups for families of schizophrenic patients. I started a borderline personality group. I was the therapist, implemented the group. I supervised and trained students in that type of work. I treated people with personality disorders specifically for a long time. But as my forensic practice grew, I had to make a choice, professionally and personally, which way I was going to go. And I found forensic work to be much more challenging to me, quite honestly. The other work was a great training experience. And in my forensic work, the good thing is that I see a lot of mentally ill individuals. Now that's not good, but it's good in terms of my continued work and professional growth. And people with personality disorders abound in the systems in which I work. They wouldn't be in those systems if they didn't have severe personality disorders.
So going back to your diagnosis, bipolar 1 with mood incongruent psychotic features.
Yes.
That is your working diagnosis for Mr. Jonchuck.
And I won't disagree that at this point the other diagnoses, there's plenty of information to make them applicable. Okay.
So if you could explain for the jury, according to the DSM-5, what bipolar 1 is.
Well, bipolar 1, without psychotic features, would be mood states where there's alternations between what we call major depressive disorder, where someone's quite depressed, not just having a bad day, and distinct periods of overactivity, or used to be called manic depressive illness, where someone has periods of time where they're not sleeping, they're overactive, they can't focus, they can become overly impulsive, spending, sexual activity, what they call unrestricted travel, and then these things cycle. And so there can be periods of depression, periods of kind of just someone feeling kind of blah, and then going back into depression or going back into a manic phase. And individuals uniformly describe oftentimes ending their manic phase into a deep depression because they're just depleted from being overactive. So that's without psychotic features.
And so with bipolar 1 disorder, there is an abnormally and persistently elevated, expansive, or irritable mood.
Yes.
And abnormally and persistently increased goal-directed activity or energy,
Yes.
and that has to last at nearly, at least 1 week for nearly every day.
Yes.
Okay. And then in addition to that, there have to be 3 or more additional symptoms.
Yes.
Okay. And one of those would be inflated self-esteem or grandiosity,
Yes.
the decreased need for sleep.
Correct.
Okay. And going back up to that first one, inflated self-esteem or grandiosity, I think you've used the word grandiosity several times in speaking about Mr. Jonchuck, right?
Yes.
How, whether it be from how other people have referred to him or what your observations are of him, he has that grandiosity
Yes.
about him. Okay. The decreased need for sleep. You're aware that Mr. Jonchuck, back between 2011 and 2013, when he was seeing Dr. Arthur, was being treated with an Ambien medication.
Yes. Yes.
Ambien is for sleep.
Well, it's for sleep. It's also, as you're going to bring this up, it's also used on the street. It has euphoric and hallucinogenic effects.
Do you think that's why Dr. Arthur prescribed it to him?
I didn't say that.
Okay. One of the next factors for bipolar 1 disorder is that the person is more talkative than usual, or there's a pressure to keep talking.
Yes.
You testified that you thought that email that John wrote to Genevieve had some pressured speech in it?
Well, it could be interpreted as that only because there was a lack of punctuation. If someone who has some good grammatical skills was put in the appropriate punctuation, I think it would be a very intact, the content of thought. But definitely, you can interpret the lack of punctuation as being rapid thinking.
And the more talkative people express to you, you testified that John would kind of go from one place to another. He was good at selling things, that sort of thing.
Well, he was described as being, always on the go and always hyper.
The next factor for bipolar 1 is flight of ideas, or the subjective experience that thoughts are raising.
Well, that would be the interpretation of the email with the punctuation.
And did you see other examples of that through your review of the records and talking with people that Mr. Jonchuck would sometimes jump from one topic to another?
Well, again, he was described as being, always, I guess for lack of better words, manicky. That it was very persistent. He was a high-energy guy who, easily got bored, moved from one activity to another. He described himself as having a strong need for stimulation and proneness to boredom when I talked to him.
Another factor for the bipolar 1 disorder is the distractibility.
Yes.
And you saw evidence of that in John?
Well, not so much when I talked with him, because again, I saw him in a controlled setting, a controlled psychiatric setting. So, his mental status at the time I met with him was relatively within normal limits. Some anxiety, I think, but he was conversant, and I didn't see, and I couldn't base a whole lot off, because he was heavily medicated, on these other things, but I saw that in records, etc.
Okay, yes.
I don't deny any of that.
I didn't mean to ask about the distractibility during the time of your evaluation with him. I was speaking back in his life leading up to the time of the offense.
Definitely.
You saw evidence of that? Okay.
Yep.
In records and through conversations with people?
Yes.
And the increase in goal-directed activity, you've talked about that quite a bit.
Whether it was driven by mania or other things we can argue about, but he would have that at times, certainly.
Excessive involvement in activities that have a high potential for painful consequences. An example listed in the book is unrestrained buying sprees or foolish business investments. You've talked on direct about Mr. Jonchuck's financial situation.
Yes.
Is excessive spending something that we see in bipolar 1 disorder?
While it can be, it doesn't necessarily. In any case, the behavior can be due to other factors or a combination thereof.
And several of these criteria that we've just talked about, they have a significant overlap with the criteria for the personality disorders, correct?
Well, that's certainly true. Well, particularly, I wouldn't say that for antisocial personality disorder when it comes down to what that particular personality disorder is all about. But certainly, and it's well known in the literature, in the mental health literature, that there's a lot of overlap or potential overlap between bipolar disorder and borderline personality disorder. Consequently, mental health professionals have developed ways to conduct differential diagnoses to determine when some people are one and when some people are another, and certainly you can have both. There's no doubt about it.
And the DSM-5 actually speaks specifically to that, to the overlap between borderline personality disorder and the bipolar disorders.
Yes.
With impulsivity being a feature of both.
While it is, there are definite ways to differentiate between one and the other, and I certainly took those steps, and it's my conclusion that both are present, obviously, by my diagnosis.
I'd like to, before we go into the specifics of the diagnosis and how you got there, if you could talk about I don't want to use the wrong word, the second portion with your diagnosis being bipolar 1 disorder with mood incongruent psychotic features. Can you tell us what that last part is?
If someone, mood incongruent means that there were psychotic features present, and some of the features would occur, let's say he was manic, or let's say he was depressed, but he could still have thoughts of grandiosity. Generally, manic goes with grandiosity. But so the psychotic features can occur in different mood states, basically. They're not limited to just one mood state. So basically, I'm saying that he has psychotic features and he has a mood disorder. Again, no argument there.
And the psychotic features, we may be talking about the hallucinations and the delusions and things like
Well,
that.
I was talking about what was present, the best that I could tell from the records and talking to Mr. Jonchuck. Ultimately on the bridge, not at the murder, but leading up to it, at least 3 weeks at least, maybe a week or two more, he was definitely unraveling this actually.
And arriving at your diagnosis of the bipolar 1 with mood incongruent psychotic features, you looked at John's sort of history, his life over the years.
Yes.
You saw that there were distinct periods of that elevated and expansive mood.
Yes.
You noted that there was the sense of inflated self-esteem or grandiosity.
Yes.
You noted that there was sleep difficulty,
Yes, at times.
feelings of worthlessness,
Yes, definitely.
a diminished ability to think and concentrate.
Yes. Well, I don't know about think, but certainly concentrate.
You had the opportunity to review the psychological and psychiatric records from John's life that were available to you, obviously.
Well, other than Dr. Arthur in the hospital, jail. I mean, that's it.
Okay. And you saw some evidence that when Mr. Jonchuck was seeing Dr. Arthur that there was an indication of the somatic hallucination?
The somatic hallucination one time, which I described yesterday. But again, my careful review of those records, in my opinion, do not reflect that Mr. Jonchuck was being treated as an individual with psychosis. And again, a summary form that was sent to Social Security Disability did not identify hallucinations or delusions.
While we're talking about the bipolar 1 disorder, I want to ask you a little bit about the history that John reported to you regarding drug use. You asked him about using illegal drugs, right?
Yes.
And he reported things to you,
Yes.
different things he had used over the years.
Well, I think he reported a couple of things to Dr. Otto that I didn't write them down. A couple of drugs that he might not have mentioned to me, but really he admitted to being a substance abuser, yes.
Okay. And there was some, well, he told you when he first used spice that it was when you could still buy it in a convenience store, right?
Yes, yeah. I remember those days. I didn't ever buy it, but I talked to a lot of people who did, that's for sure.
And you testified that John told you he had last used spice in December of 14, right?
Yes.
Okay. You're aware from seeing the other reports and depots and hearing all the testimony that there's been some variation in when he's reported that he last used spice?
I can't recall, to be honest. I mean, if you say so, I'll take the word for it. He told me around Christmas time in mid-December.
You've heard that and have seen in the records that John has said he last used when he lived with Melody Dishman?
Honestly, I don't recall that.
Oh, okay.
But if it's in the records, it's in the records.
And in all the records, we know that John moved out from living with Melody Dishman by Halloween of 2014.
Around that time, I thought it was like the end of September, but yeah, so I'm a month off there. He had told me that he had stopped briefly and then relapsed. Okay, so I think he told me that he had stopped around, I think at the end of September, but relapsed in December 2014. So there's sort of, two stops and starts, so to speak.
In the controlled environment that John has been in since you've seen him, certainly, and since before, you believe that the substance use disorder is in a remission state because he's in this controlled environment?
Well, I don't know how it would be if he was out, so that's not my diagnostic specifier, it's the DSM's diagnostic specifier. When someone's evaluated and they're in custody, their substance abuse disorder is just in remission in a controlled setting because no one knows what it would be otherwise.
Right. Okay. So as of right now, according to the DSM-5 and what you've indicated, it's in a sustained remission because he's in a controlled environment.
In terms of street drugs, yes.
You also diagnosed John with a generalized anxiety disorder.
Yes.
And when we're talking about that, describe for the jury, because I know you had the personality disorders on the boards. Talk to the jury about what the anxiety disorder is.
Well, I think a simple way is generalized means it goes on all the time. It's not specific to, when you go to the store, or drive over a bridge, or get into a car. But anxiety, without looking in the DSM, I think the common sense aspect of an anxiety disorder, again, this is ongoing. Someone's always nervous, they're prone to racing thoughts, they're worried, they have feelings of apprehension, like something's going to happen, so they have this kind of feeling of nervousness, like that any moment the door's going to open and a German Shepherd that's angry is going to walk through. I mean, it's always had this apprehension that something's going to occur, and I guess feelings of foreboding. So there's this like ongoing nervousness.
So this is not somebody, for example, who, is a sophomore in college and is really worried about their biology test one morning.
Well, that might be called an adjustment disorder if it went on a bit, not just one evening. An adjustment disorder with, anxious mood.
Maybe I could do that example.
He had this ongoing anxiety. Yes. And as I said yesterday, I talked to him about panic attacks, and you might remember, you were there. I mean, we
do
went
remember.
over it in some detail, and he didn't identify it.
Okay.
I think there's one or two notes of panic in Dr. Arthur's reports, but it was not persistent. And there might have been some panic more in November, December of 2014 from the hospital records that I reviewed more recently. But he has anxiety.
Okay, and so my point was, I perhaps chosen that example. When we're talking about diagnosing somebody with a generalized anxiety disorder, according to the DSM, this is not somebody who is just has a morning where they're worried about something
No.
and they go on with their lives.
No.
Okay, this is a persistent, ongoing thing.
Yes.
And it can include restlessness
Yes.
and difficulty concentrating
Yes.
and irritability.
Correct.
Speaking of those panic attacks that you asked John about, when you were evaluating him, you did ask him about symptoms that he had of feeling anxious?
Yes.
And he told you that sometimes his heart would beat really fast?
Yes.
And that he would be paranoid?
Yes. Well, I'd have to look to be sure, but I believe so, yes.
When you asked him about panic attacks, and again, this is your evaluation at the hospital while he's medicated,
Yes.
but he told you, not so much anymore, but I did in my younger years.
Okay.
Okay. And you asked him about what symptoms he had when he had those panic attacks?
I'm sure I did.
Okay. Do you need to look at your notes?
Yeah, I'm happy to.
You all ready for lunch? Yeah, okay. We'll break now and then go to Thursday. We'll come back at 1:15. Thank you very much.
Jury's out of hearing.
Okay, anything we need to address? Okay. See everybody at 1:15.